Good. All right. Well, I'm Jason. For those of you who don't know me yet, I hope to meet you today. That'd be awesome. We are in a series called Family Tree. We're in a week 3 of this series. I hope you do join us for one of our Christmas services, either Friday night or Saturday night. It's going to be a special time just to it's going to be family friendly. There's going to be childcare from 0 to 4, I think, and the rest of the kiddos are going to be in here with us. We're going to do things that are going to be for them as well as for adults. It's going to be kind of a family-friendly event. It's going to be pretty awesome and just a great way to celebrate Christmas. But before we do that, we're going to talk a little bit about Jesus' family tree. And we've taken this out of the book of Matthew, chapter 1. We've been spending some time in the first 16 verses, which we have dubbed some of the most boring in all of the Bible. And we just wanted to kind of walk through this because it just says this person was the father of this person, who was the father of this person, who was the father of this person. And it looks boring until you start digging into some of the stories. And in those first 16 verses, what Matthew does, and it's irregular for the day, is he parenthetically includes 4 women before we get to Mary. He includes 4 women in the family tree of Jesus. Women that were part of the lineage, part of the genealogy. There were other, probably more famous women that we would know of, and rather than the ones that Matthew illuminated for us. He got some of those, but some others, he wanted us to go back and Google who they were. And so we were spending a couple of weeks talking about some of these women in Matthew chapter 1, and we're going to do another one today because their stories are fascinating. And when you read through their stories, you start digging through their stories, you find that there's really a common thread within the story of each of these women. And it's the same common thread that I think applies to you today because it applies to me today. And if I'm the only one, I'm going to feel really sad. And that is this truth, that life is complicated. Right? If any of you have to put together a toy, you know there can be complications. There's always something missing or something doesn't work just quite right. It breaks when you almost get it completed. Life can be complicated, but we're not necessarily talking about toys today. We're talking about life, right? We're talking about relationships. We're talking about families, or we're talking about just the things that are happening throughout our lives that can create complications. And in Jesus' family tree, it was no different. That's one of the things I want us to take away from this whole series, is that in Jesus' family, there was a lot of complications. So there's nothing to be ashamed of. There's nothing to kind of say, you know what, well, Jesus was perfect, and his family must have been perfect, and Mary was perfect, and then all this, we kind of go dig back into Jesus' family tree, whoa, there were some crazy things that happened, just like in my family, because God uses complications. God works in the midst of complications. God uses complicated people in complicated situations. He can use whomever he wants, however he wants, whenever he wants. And we see that illustrated in the lives of these women. So don't shortchange yourself is what I'm trying to say. Good night, everyone. All right. No. This was awesome. In week 1, we talked about Tamar. We talked about, and if you don't know Tamar, I encourage you either go back and listen to week 1 and watch week 1, or Google it for yourself. Last week we talked about a woman who is a little bit more popular than Tamar, Rahab, and she was a prostitute, and we talked about how she's sprinkled throughout all of the Bible and how she lived an integrated life of faith. And there was so much that we can learn from Rahab. And today we're going to look at another one of these ladies. But before we get started, though, I want to talk a little bit about how we make decisions. Because when life is complicated, we tend to have to make decisions that are complex. We have to make decisions that aren't necessarily where it is. We know exactly what we are supposed, where we're supposed to go. Which direction we're supposed to take. I'm not necessarily talking about moral decisions. I'm talking about, should I go left or should I go right? Which direction should I go? Where should I? I really think that there's something that in this story that we're going to look at, we're going to unpack today that's going to help you in this process. And I'm not going to give you the answer because I don't really want to do that. What I really would like to do is I just want to tee up a conversation between you and God. That's my intent today, because if I can give you, if I give you the answers, then it doesn't work out and you blame me. I'd rather you just have a conversation with God. All right, so with this, we're going to talk a little bit about decision making. I think that when we talk about this, when we take these three things that we're going to talk about, I think they will lead to fewer decisions that we are going to regret. I think it'll lead to we will stop second guessing maybe some decisions a little bit more often. Maybe you won't feel some of the weight of some of these past decisions, because I don't know about you, but I can think of a few decisions in my life where I'm like, you know what, that was a bad decision. Or maybe some that are like, that was a really bad decision, you know? And I know hindsight is 2020, but we do have a tendency sometimes to kind of really, hammer our mistakes and beat ourselves up on our bad decisions that we've made in the past. And so what I want to deal with that today, and I really want to kind of talk about this from a biblical perspective, but I think that we need to first talk a little bit about the Bible as it relates to kind of what this really is. And this may not be popular, but I'm going to talk about it anyways, because I think it's right. The Bible is not a manual for living. It's not a manual, it's a revelation of Jesus. If it was a manual for living, you would do the 613 laws that were in the Old Testament. And all I would say is, good luck. Right? In fact, even if you said, you know what, Pastor Jason, I'm going to throw out the Old Testament. Don't do that. But the New Testament, like a manual for living, I would say there are probably some things that you shouldn't do that you find in Scripture that some of the leaders of the church did. There's some certain things that Paul did with his life that maybe you shouldn't emulate, right? So it's not a manual for living, it's a revelation of who Jesus is. The entire thing is a revelation. Now, it's filled with some transcendent principles. Like one example is Matthew 7:12, right? We call it the golden rule. Do to others as you would have them do to you. If you don't want to be canceled, don't cancel other people. If you don't want people yelling at your kids, maybe don't yell at their kids, right? Like it's a good principle to live by, right? Do to others as you. So there's one example of that. There's a lot of examples of transcendent principles that are in Scripture that we can say we can build our life on, but it's not a manual because the Word of God is living and active. You get a manual from your workplace, guess what? It's just paper and rules, policies. This is something that's living and active, and it's about the people who are living and active. So we're going to talk about some of these things that in this story today that we're going to look at, and we're going to say, hey, there's some things that we can pull out that even though they happened thousands of years ago, man, there's something new that God is bringing to our minds today. And it's revealing and illuminating some things that are applicable right here and right now in my life, even though it happened thousands of years ago. And it's right here, kind of right now type of gospel. But a lot of the Bible is made up of these stories, and we have to dig deep into these stories. It's not a manual. So looking at Ruth's story, we're going to look at Ruth today. In fact, in Matthew chapter 1, verse 5, this is kind of where we left off. Salmon was the father of Boaz, whose mother was Rahab. We talked about her last week. Check it out. Boaz was the father of Obed, whose mother was Ruth. So back-to-back women named in the same verse, right? So it's apparently Matthew really liked this section of the family tree of Jesus. Like, I want to illuminate this. And we talked about Rahab last week. Today we're going to talk a little bit about Ruth. And Ruth is kind of, it's not like Tamar. She's not like Rahab. She actually has a book in the Bible named after her, right? So it's pretty easy to go find the story of Ruth. We just kind of look at it's a 4-chapter book. You could read it while I'm talking if you wanted to. Don't do that. I'm going to summarize it for you. I want to give you a little bit of background because Ruth is not the first character mentioned in this book. Last week we were looking at Rahab, and she's a contemporary of Joshua. So the nation of Israel had been kind of had been lost in wilderness for 40 years. They'd been hoping to get to the promised land. They just couldn't quite get there. They'd been wishing for the promise. They'd been dreaming about the promised land. And they were holding out hope that one day they would get there. But for 40 years, they were kind of wondering. And they were waiting to finally inhabit the promised land. So Joshua, who actually leads them into the promised land, and the walls of Jericho fall down, and they go in and they take over. And we looked at this guy last week who we just read about, Salmon, who was the father of Boaz, whose mother was Rahab. Salmon was called the father of Bethlehem. And Bethlehem was a very fertile agricultural place. In fact, it's actually called the house of bread. In the book of Deuteronomy, God says, made a covenant with the nation and said, if you are obedient, if you will be obedient to me culturally, I will be obedient to you. I'll make sure you have food. I will make sure you have crops. I will make sure you have bread. I'll make sure you're doing good. So what happens? They go into the promised land, and in shockingly short order, it just becomes all unraveled. It becomes a mess. They're breaking rules. They're disobeying God. It's kind of like if I were to say, hey, have a talk with my son before we go into some sort of video game arcade or fun house extravaganza and say, okay, we're going to talk about the rules. And I number one rule, and before I even get that out, he's outgoing, having a great time. He's breaking the rules, just running amok and running havoc and creating a mess. So it's short order. The Israelites decide, you know what, we got this awesome fun house of a promised land that we get to go play in. And they start breaking rules, disobeying God. And what happens? God keeps his promises. So there's famine in the land. There's no food in the land. So there's a guy here at the beginning of the book of Ruth called Elimelech and his wife Naomi. And they have to leave the promised land. They've been there. They've tasted the goodness of the land, but they have to leave because there's no food in the land. And they go to the wilderness where for 40 years of inhabiting the wilderness, now they've gone back to they've gone to the promised land. Now they're going back to the wilderness because there's no food. There's famine in that land. They've got to go back through the wilderness of Judea. They've got to go back near the Dead Sea. They have to recross the Jordan River to the land of Moab, to a place where they don't know anybody, a place that's unfamiliar, and that's where they live. So they're like sojourners, which means kind of like, I'm going to take a little quick trip. And that's what they were planning on doing. They weren't even planning on unpacking their bags. This is going to be quick. We're going to stay here a little bit, and then we're going to go back to our hometown. And that sojourn turned out to be 10 years. It's a little bit different, right? You have to unpack your bags if you've been there for 10 years. So 10 years they're there. By the way, I'm sure anticipated that once we get to Moab, it's going to be way better. It's going to be better than where we left. There was no food. There was a famine. It's going to be better than our hometown that has a famine. And actually, when it comes to this particular family, things go from bad to worse almost immediately. They go from bad to worse. It's about as excruciating of a decade as you can possibly imagine. Have you ever had a bad decade? Don't raise your hand. Don't raise your hand. If you ever had a bad decade, you know how annoying it is when somebody complains to you about their bad day, right? It's oh, let me talk to you about my bills. Oh, let me talk to you about my medical bills. I've had a bad decade. You want to talk to me about your hangnail? No, please, no. I've had a bad decade. And that's what Elimelech and Naomi are going through in the midst of this. They've had 10 years from bad to worse, almost immediately. Elimelech dies. Naomi's husband dies. She had 2 sons. Now she's kind of single mom in this foreign land. And the thing is, her sons fall in love with the 2 Moabite women. And now they get married. And then within 10 years, they're still living in that land. Both her sons die. Now there's 3 widows. And there's nothing that was lower on the totem pole than a childless widow of the day. Now you got 3 of them, all hanging out. It's the lowest place in society. And it was Naomi, and it was Ruth and Orpah, her daughter-in-laws. And they're trying to pick up the pieces. And so this is just in the first couple verses of Ruth, chapter 1. So you're like, this is getting interesting. We haven't even met Ruth yet, right? They come to this kind of crossroads of decision making. What are we going to do? Where are we going to go? And if this story kind of if you have anything in common with the story, you're trying to you might be in a place where you're trying to figure out what's next, or where am I trying to go, or what am I supposed to do, or where am I leading towards, and what's God trying to do, or and you're trying to start with what makes sense. That's kind of the go-to logical place. Let's start with what makes sense. And in verse 6, we see that Naomi actually gets word that things in her hometown are getting better. Like the famine is gone, the economy is kind of going up again, things are turning around, things are going well, and she's got a certain responsibility for her two daughter-in-laws, and so she begins to say, hey, let's pack it up, we're going to go back home, we're going to go back to Bethlehem, and we're starting on this journey, and as they're starting on this journey, she's like, hold up, wait a second. These are two Moabite women. The Israelite men are not going to marry my daughter-in-laws. It's not going to happen. Taking them to Jerusalem, these Israelite men are not going to marry them because it's against the law. So we kind of got away with it when we were living in Moab, but we're going to go there and we're all going to be single just like we are here. And Naomi is feeling really bad in this situation. And she's kind of taking it personally. And they kind of come to this crossroads of decision making. What are we going to do? Where are we going to go? So they start with what makes sense. She says a little bit later to her daughter-in-laws, she's like, I feel for your sake. I feel terribly for your sake because God's hand is against me. Naomi takes it personally. Naomi takes it really hard. She says, God has raised his fist against me. How did she come to that conclusion? Well, it doesn't really say in the text that God was punishing her, or that God was against her. But here's what we know. It wasn't totally illogical that she came to this thought because, remember like 2 weeks ago, we talked a little bit about Tamar, and both of Tamar's husbands died because of sin. And in a certain sense, you got Naomi taking kind of an inventory of her life and kind of getting the sense that maybe we should have just never left the promised land. Maybe we should have toughed it out. We should have stuck it out. And maybe instead of leaving and going to Moab, maybe God is punishing me for leaving. Maybe God's punishing me for giving my sons to these Moabite women. Maybe God has raised up his hand to get me. So she starts to like blame herself and starts to condemn herself and accumulate all these kind of debts in her mind and takes it personally. God must be against me. And I don't want it to spill over onto the two of them. So what she says is, she's like one of these people. I think Naomi's probably pretty awesome because she's doing this and she's kind of taking this, but we see in the text that neither Ruth nor Orpah want to leave her side. They are so like just connected to Naomi that they don't really want to be separated from her. So while she's taking all this heat herself, she's not projecting it to her daughter-in-laws. She says this, why don't you go back to your hometowns? And they hold on to her. They weep bitterly. They don't want to leave. Like, go back to your parents. Go back to your mom's house. Go back to your dad's house. There are plenty of men who will marry you. Your odds will go way up if you go back to your home. But if you come with me, it's like a slim to none chance that somebody's going to marry you. And it would be basically saying, I'm going to be a widow for the rest of my life. And even with that, they didn't want to let her go. They were so connected to Naomi. And it says that when Naomi finally got back to Bethlehem, she was like, everybody was like, oh, it's Naomi, we miss you, whatever. And she's like, don't call me Naomi, call me Mara, which means bitter. She literally is like, I don't want to be called Naomi, which means kind of the pleasantness of God, right? I don't want to be called that. I want to be called bitter because God's hand is against me. I made wrong decisions. I made bad decisions. I'm beating myself up about these decisions. Call me bitter. So she gives both her and daughter-in-laws advice in this way. Go home. Go back to your hometowns. Go back to your mom and dad's. Go back to your culture. She says, go back to your gods, kind of lowercase gods. Go back. She's a pretty awesome person, but she's in so much pain. She's really kind of given some bad advice, even to herself. And I want to encourage you. I know this is a lot easier said than done. It's a lot easier to be up here with lights and whatever talking about this than to actually do this. But I really want to give you a piece of advice, and this is something that we can learn from Naomi, is that don't name what you're going through while you're going through it. Don't name what you're going through while you're going through it. While you're going through it, it is possibly the worst time to mark anything at that moment. You will remember that you are in kind of peak emotional state. Don't name what you're going through while you're going through it. Take some time to kind of see it for what it is, because all of a sudden you're going to change your name from being pleasant to God must be against me because I made some really bad decisions. I'm ruined. And that's not really true. It's just how you're feeling in the time. Don't name it. It's okay to feel it. Who could blame Naomi for feeling bitter? Who could blame Naomi for second guessing? Who could blame Naomi for feeling responsible personally? Who could blame Naomi for feeling that? You can feel it. So she says to these two young ladies, to Orpah and to Ruth, go home. Now, the Bible says that the two of them held her, they cried, multiple times, they're trying to figure out what to do, and they see these two women at a crossroads. Orpah and Ruth, they're at a crossroads. They have to make a difficult decision, and Orpah decides, you know what, I'm going to go home. I'm going to go home. I'm going to go back to my hometown. I'm going to go back to my mom. I'm going to find a husband. And she goes back home at that point. And Ruth does something else. Ruth makes a decision in the moment. She would have been totally justified to go home. I don't think Orpah was in a difficult position. She had to make a decision. I think theologians kind of blast Orpah for doing that. I'm like, that was a difficult decision. Naomi basically said, hey, you can do it. Go ahead. And she made the decision. I think to do that. Ruth did something else. She could have been totally justified to go home if she wanted to, but this is what it says in chapter 1, starting in verse 16. Ruth replied, don't ask me to leave you and turn back. She says, wherever you go, I will go. I will live. Wherever you live, I will live. Your people will be my people. Your God will be my God. Wherever you die, I will die, and there I will be buried. May God punish me severely if I allow anything but death to separate us. And when Naomi saw that Ruth was determined to go with her, she said nothing more. So like I said, biblical scholars hammer Orpah. They're like, she's disloyal. She should have never left. I'm like, I'm not here. Like, I don't know. Like, I don't think she owed Naomi anything. Naomi even said it to her, gave her blessing. She said, I pray that God would bless you because you have been so good to me and my sons. I pray that you are good. You don't owe me anything. So she's at a point where she's got to make this difficult decision. And it wasn't a sin decision. It was a difficult life decision. It was logical. Ruth was making a decision for her. And she made the decision to stay, which is in a very atypical path. To go from a place where she was most likely going to be alone. Essentially, for the rest of her life, it was going to be her and Naomi. She wasn't going to have any cover, which again, in many ways, didn't make sense. So how do you make these decisions? How do you make difficult life decisions? Not moral decisions, sin decisions, but difficult life trajectory decisions. Because it was written during that time in the book of Judges, it says that people in that day did what was right in their own eyes. So they're making these decisions. That's not what I'm really talking about. I'm not talking about do whatever you want. In fact, Paul talks about this in the New Testament. He says, hey, we don't sin so that grace will abound. It's like we don't have a free license to sin just so that God can show off His grace. Like you do whatever you want because it doesn't matter. Grace will abound even more. He's like, no. That's not how it goes. Of course we don't do that. So we're not talking about things like that, whether I should lie or not, whether I should cheat or not, whether I should do immoral things. We're not talking about that. We're talking about, hey, you're at a crossroads. I have to make a decision. Should I go home? Should I stay? Should I go here? Should I go to Bethlehem? What should I do? What path should I take? The atypical path or the path that maybe might make more sense? I'm not sure what to do. So I'm going to try to help us with this a little bit today. And again, I'm not giving you the answers. This is a tee-up conversation between you and God. So when we talk about this, we're going to look at our past, our present, and our future. Because I think these are key. Our past, our present, and our future. Because what we're going to do here is get to the decision. And again, as I mentioned earlier, I'm just teeing this thing up for you. So when you think of the past, I want you to think of the word wisdom. Think of the word wisdom. When you think of your past, think of wisdom. Wisdom is evaluating, it's digging deep into your life experiences, pulling out this kind of salient points from your past, having the courage and discipline to dig in and go like, what have I learned from where I've been? Because here's the thing, life experience doesn't necessarily make you wiser. Doesn't make you smarter. Life experience doesn't make you smarter. Let me put it that way. That's why there's a slogan like, there ain't no fool like an old fool, right? Their life experience doesn't necessarily make you smarter. Have you ever met somebody you were like, they're just the same as they were in high school? Yeah. Like nothing in life has changed. They didn't get smarter in any way. And it's kind of sad. Life experience doesn't just make you smarter. And so wisdom, you have to look at wisdom. Well, none of the wisdom sank in, like if it's that person. So you have to look at the wisdom that's sunk in, the wisdom to go into your past and dig it in and find the gems. I've been mining for gold. I'm finding truth. I'm really taking an honest inventory. I'm failing forward. And you see you're making a decision, like you're Ruth. Or you're Orpah, and you're like, I'm at a crossroads. I'm trying to decide. Do I go back to my mom and dad's house? Do I go with Naomi? I know what makes sense, but I'm trying to feel this thing out. I know what conventional wisdom says is right for me. But you want to take some time to really unpack that in prayer and in counsel. And what have I learned in my life? What patterns have I been in self-awareness? What have I learned from the world around me? What have I learned about self? And so you start digging into some of the wisdom of your past. When we talk about present, I want you to think of the word values. Values. What are your value? What do you value? There are some core values that you may have all your life, and then there are some certain things that you value differently in different seasons of your life. There are some things that different people value in different ways. So what do you value? I'm going to kind of read into the text for a little bit, but just let's say an example. Let's say Orpah and Ruth. Maybe not for Orpah. It was really important for Orpah that she would have a family. It was really important for her that she would have a child, let's say. So if that was her value, like I really need to have a family. I think that's a big value of mine. Yeah, it makes sense to go back to your hometown because that's going to be the path that makes that happen. But Ruth made a different decision. She's like, I don't know. Like, if it does, it does. If it doesn't, it doesn't. I feel like there was a different value standard for Ruth than there was for Orpah, and that's fine. So for Orpah, I'm going to go back to my hometown because this is my best chance, and because I value this. And Ruth might say, you know what? It's fine. I'm cool with it. I'm just going to let it play itself out. I don't value that as much as her. So think about this. There's something that is actually verbalized in the text when Naomi says, go back to your hometown, go back to your gods. Think about what Ruth says. We just read it. Think about what Ruth says. I'm going with you. I will go wherever you go. I will live wherever you live. Your people will be my people. Now she's kind of ramping up here. Okay, she's ramping it up. It's like she's like this. I mean, this is like the music is rumbling, like it's starting to fade in, right? It's like the movie of Ruth, and right, it's like tense. It's like going to be. I will go wherever you go. I will live wherever you live. Your people will be my people. She's ramping it up, and then she kind of puts the cherry on top. Your God will be my God. She's making a decision to migrate toward her ultimate value. Says, my value, yeah, maybe I would like to have a family, I would like to have a husband, but my ultimate value here, what Ruth is saying is, I see that your God will be my God, Naomi. I'm going with you. This is what I'm going to tell you when your decisions in relationships or career and what you do. One question I would have you ask yourself is this taking me toward God or away from God? When you're at a crossroads, maybe career, maybe relationships, is this path taking me towards God or is it taking me away from God? Right? Let's take relationships. I know they're funny, right? I know they got a nice car. I know they kind of, you have a good time together. Time flies when you're together. I know all that is true. All that's good. Are you moving towards God, or is it kind of taking you away from God? If I ask you, what are your 3 most important values? Can you articulate them? Do you know what they are? If you don't know what you really deep down value, it's going to be really hard for you to wrestle around this thing, because you're going to have to really wrestle your values to the ground to understand at some point at these crossroads, I'm going to understand that I have to take part of my wisdom, but in order to make a great decision, I have to know what I value in the present. And you can say, hey, well, this is important to me, this is not important to me, or what have you. For Ruth, what she was saying is, my commitment to go with Naomi is I would rather follow you and God and work the rest of my life in the field and have everybody tell me, all this kind of things. I'm cool with that because I value that more. So she made her decision. The last thing is future. When we talk about future, I want us to think about hopes. Our hopes. What are your hopes? What are your dreams? What are the place that you sense God is leading you towards? The place that, here's what I'm going to tell you. If you're kind of by nurture an ambitious person, if you are by nature a visionary person, if you have a lot of dreams, that self-awareness in your prayer life is allowing God to show you maybe an area where your hope could possibly become an idol. Sometimes people have such big dreams, such big hopes, such big aspirations, and the vision is so clear in their head that they somehow find a way to make every prayer scream that, and it becomes a confirmation bias, and you're looking for it everywhere. You're like, okay, I'm looking for it everywhere. Okay, and every time you kind of see a green light, you're like, that's it. The Lord must be saying yes. He's telling me to go. I want to tell you that there are some times that in order to walk in obedience to God, you're going to have to kind of turn down what might appear a direct path to a dream. There may be something that appears to be a direct path, because for Ruth, it's like, okay, this makes the most sense. This is the most logical. I'm going to go back to my hometown. I've gotten a free pass. I'm going to be able to live my life. Yeah, it's been complicated so far. Yeah, my life has been difficult. Yeah, I've got married. My husband passed away. I had to make this big decision, but this is going to be the next. I'm going to put this chapter behind me. I'm going to go on to the next chapter. I'm going to find myself another man. I'm going to raise up a family, and life's going to be okay. That would have been, Orpah made that decision. Ruth said, you know what, I don't know. Like, that seems to be like a good, clear, logical path, but there's something drawing me this way. And it's my values. It's the wisdom that I've gained through this time, and it's the hopes that I have for my future. And it may not pan out the way that I imagined it when I was growing up as a little girl, but it's going to be okay. Because my values have changed from when I was a little girl. Ruth was obedient to God. Ruth was obedient to the right direction without any clarity on how this thing was going to work out. Sometimes you have to walk in obedience. You have to pick a direction, and even when you don't have a solution in advance, you don't have all the answers kind of figured out. In fact, what it says in the book of Proverbs, chapter 3, is it says, trust in the Lord with all your heart and lean not on your own understanding. Don't depend on your own understanding. In all your ways, acknowledge Him, move to Him, and He will show you which path you're supposed to take. Trust in the Lord with all your heart. Lean not on your own understanding. In all your ways, acknowledge Him, and He will direct your path. Maybe I should go back to my hometown. And there's probably a better chance that I get married there and be able to have Social Security there. I can make this sense. And I do miss home. And if I go to Israel, these guys aren't going to do anything. I don't know. But I don't want to leave Naomi. And I actually think this decision would actually move me toward God, not away from God. So I'm going to do this. Difficult decision. Life is complicated. So over time, I kind of get more and more comfortable to say, hey, can we tee this up for everybody? Because this is a conversation between you and God. Because we have to think about our past, our present, our future, the wisdom, the values, the hopes that you have. Because this is a good conversation between you and Jesus. Because what worked for me might not work for you, right? And what works for you might not work for me. Now, what God is telling, what God is leading us into. There's some transcendent principles, and hey, this isn't about right or wrong or moral or immoral. This is about difficult decisions. How do we make difficult decisions? We have to think about these things differently. So I don't want to start telling you what to do or superimposing my ideas on you. What I really would love for you to do is to pray this through, because honestly, your prayers work just as well. So what have you learned? What do you believe? Take it to the Lord. And when you feel kind of clear in your spirit, here's what I would advise. I'd say, trust God's grace. Trust God's grace. If you went from past, present, future, and you took your wisdom and your values and your hopes and you brought it to the Lord and you prayed about it and you let the Lord kind of search you and you let the Lord show you what's the right way. You let the Lord speak to you, and then you kind of get that confirmation. You take that and you trust God's grace. Don't spend the rest of your life second guessing. What if it goes off the deep end? What if it wasn't the right decision? You don't spend your life second guessing that you made the right decision, whether to go home or to go to Bethlehem or to go this decision or that way. You go with it, you trust God's grace. You let Him speak to you, and He'll show you which path to take, and then you have to trust Him. Now, each of us in this journey, when we find ourselves in kind of these crossroad moments, you might be there right now and you kind of figure out, where do I go? One of these decisions, I have to figure this out. You may not get an answer right away. You may not get an answer right away. You may not get an answer, this may not be one single prayer. The Lord may take you into one of these areas and maybe even reorient some values. Maybe if your first step is to sit down and even, write down what your values are. Really spend some time praying into it. Maybe you take those and you kind of go, Lord, are these the values you want for me? Are these the values you want me to have, or did my family of origin give me these values? Did culture give me these values? Did I learn these, from just kind of living through this life? Do these values align with you? Maybe the Lord, helps you get that right. Maybe it takes some time before you plunge into the next thing, plunge into the next move or the next direction decision that you're going to take. So take some time to evaluate this thing. Maybe it's that one nugget to help you know which path it is to take, and maybe it's a reminder of hope that you start to see something that's maybe atypical. That it's like, what, this is taking me towards God, not away from God, and so I want to pay more attention to that. I want to evaluate that a little bit more. And that might be a difficult decision, but it might be the one I'm supposed to take. That's kind of the end of the story with Ruth. Ruth goes, as a Moabite woman, she goes back to Bethlehem. And to what she thinks is going to be her lot in life. I'm just going to be working. I'm going to be kind of scrounging in the field, on the edge of the fields. I'm going to be working, and her and Naomi. And, she's there. I'm going to provide for her and Naomi. And a man by the name of Boaz spots her. He's like, who is that? I like her. And they explain to Boaz who she is. And kind of long story short, he kind of works within the law. And he falls in love with her and redeems her. And he not only redeems her, but he also redeems Naomi. And then at the end of the text, Naomi's friends actually say to her that Ruth, she's better to you than 7 sons. She's been better to you than 7 sons. God has a way of doing things that you don't know about. There's a Boaz out there that you may know nothing about. Not literally. So I'm like, whoa. God has a way of doing things and providing things for you that you have you don't know anything about. And oftentimes we try to make decisions based on let's figure out all the answers and all the pieces, and let's put these things together and what make the most logical sense. And Ruth was like, what? Even if my lot in life was just to work the fields until the day I die, and I'm dying with Naomi, your God will be my God. I will go where you go. I will live where you live. I'm cool with that. She made that decision. I think God was like, you know what? I got something for you. that you don't know anything about. I got a Boaz that you don't know anything about just yet, but you're making a decision to go into a direction that is the right path for her. So she goes and she finds Boaz, and he redeems her, and she's better to Naomi than 7 sons. And I think we have to maintain hope in the middle of the whole thing. And I don't know what you're going through. I don't know if you're kind of in a crossroads moment, but there may not seem like there's a lot of hope in the middle of it. There may not seem like there's a way, through this that is easy or a path that makes sense. Maybe you feel like too much time has passed, or it seems like you've gone to a place that, things can't happen in that place. I can't go back, or I can't go on. It just doesn't work. I'll say is you bring those things to the Lord. Bring your past, your present, your future, your wisdom, your values, your hopes to the Lord. And maybe the Lord starts to take your hope and stoke it a little bit to something that you kind of never thought of. Maybe you thought was different. Something that you never thought could happen. Something that you never thought could take place, because now, now this is happening here beyond what you can imagine, beyond what you can kind of see in your mind's eye, because God can see things in His mind. He has got plans that we don't know anything about. So pray this thing through. Pick a direction, commit to it. Ruth said, I'm with you. Wherever you go, I will go. Where you die, I will die. Make a decision and then trust God's grace. What if I make the wrong decision? Trust the grace of God. I started this talk today saying, how many people have made a bad decision in their life? I know I have, I don't know how many hands I can raise. Made bad decisions. I'm trusting that I'm probably not the only one. But God's grace has brought us right here, right now. We trust God's grace. He will lead us to what's next. The bad decision doesn't ruin anything. Oh, but you don't know what my decision was. It was really, really, really bad. Trust God's grace. You're still here. Trust God's grace. Through the grace of God. Not everyone's going to give you grace. Don't worry about them. Trust God's grace. If God's calling you back to your hometown, go back to your hometown. If God's calling you to go to uncharted waters, go towards uncharted waters. But trust the grace of God. So we have Ruth, who's this Moabite woman who wasn't going to be part of this story, wasn't going to be part of the family tree at all, until Elimelech and Naomi decided they had to leave the promised land because of a famine. They leave the promised land. Their son gets married to Ruth. Ruth comes back with Naomi. Nothing. They would not have planned this, right? You don't like, what we're going to do, family? We're going to go to this other place. You're going to die. You two are going to die. And then this other girl that we don't know yet, she's going to come back with me. And she becomes the great-grandmother of King David. So that we see that her father-in-law, Salmon, the father of Bethlehem, the founder of Bethlehem, she goes back and she sees this, and now her family starts this new path, this new direction. Boaz finds her, falls in love with her, redeems her. She has a son who then has another son who's now that of King David. And now we see the family lineage, just like Pastor Tom said, like in Luke chapter 2, for unto you is born this day in the city of David, Christ the Lord. In Jesus' family tree, it was complicated. There was death, there was disease, there was going back through, making difficult decisions and coming back and forth and just seeing what life does. Life happens. What can we learn from that? When you're facing a difficult decision, take your past, present, and future. Take your wisdom, take values, take your hopes, present it to the Lord, have this conversation with God, and just make the decision, and then just trust His grace. Trust His grace. Let me pray for you this morning. Lord, we thank you. We thank you for your work. We thank you for your principles. We thank you that for the really large stories of people like Ruth, and people maybe who are like Ruth, who are in situations where they really don't know what to do. They don't have any certainty. They don't have a guarantee. And yet, God, there's some gravitational pull that for Ruth, pulls her in a direction, and ultimately she's trusting and displaying faith in you. God, I thank you for this woman who went to Bethlehem, most likely believing that it was her lot in life to be working in a field as a single mom, single woman, single mom, single woman for the rest of her life. Actually ended up becoming a great-grandmother of King David. So Lord, I thank you for this one. I thank you for the one that is hearing this and starting to kind of get into their head, and it's right now they're kind of cross themselves off the list because they don't see a conventional path, they don't see a typical path. They don't see a door that seems to be open the direction that they seem to be going. And yet, God, if you can take Ruth and make her what she ultimately became, ultimately part of the story, part of the lineage, part of the family tree of Jesus, Lord, we know you can do the same with us. We know you have something in mind for us. So I pray, God, in this moment, God, would you cause hope to rise up where it's dried up? Would you restore it and release it into the hearts of your people? Would you help us make decisions that bring us towards you? We pray these things in Jesus' name. Amen.